The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host, Jim Mars.
When all the young people in Britain started throwing tantrums and rioting in the streets, the Washington Post tells us that they somewhat resemble the street uprisings in the Middle East, but the British rioters seem motivated more by greed than political fervor. So in other words, they don't have any problems with their political system, it's just greed, okay? Kind of like when our ancestors brought about a revolution to fight off the occupation of this country by British troops. Of course, they were British citizens, so actually it was their own troops, but they held a revolution, and they are still framed as patriots and forefathers and founding fathers of the great American Republic, home of the free, land of the brave. But when we look at people in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, and when they try to throw off the occupying force while they're insurgents or pro-terrorist, isn't it funny how words shift around depending on who's using them and how they want to use them? But we won't go into deep, dark things tonight because I'm sure most of you all are probably interested in the extraordinary and the anomalous. I love that. There's another word that I love, anomaly. Anomaly. Anomaly is, just a kind of a scientific term for WTF, right? What the heck is that? I don't know. It's an anomaly. So when you hear somebody say, well, that's anomalous, then you know, well, they don't know what it is. And that's okay too, because I think all of us occasionally come across things we don't really quite know what it is. But most of us are honest enough to say, what the heck? I don't know what that is. But a scientist, is kind of like a doctor. They can't admit that they don't know everything. So they say, well, that's an anomaly. Oh, okay. Well, I got it. And speaking of anomalies, I'm sure that on this program and many others, some of the questions that will be coming in, we'll be asking about the ubiquitous UFOs, identified flying objects, and we probably need to come up with another term because I can point to the night sky and I can see red and green flashing lights, and I know it's an airplane, but it's dark. I can't see what kind it is, so it's a unidentified flying object. And of course, we all know that a lot of things that are counted as UFOs probably have a mundane explanation. Satellites, military test craft, things like that. That's why I really like to go back and look at old UFO incidents. In fact, I live very close to one right now. I'm about 8 miles down the road from a little town called Aurora, Texas. And those of you who don't know about Aurora, Texas, there's even a state historical marker there that says, legend has it that in 1897, a spaceship crashed here and the pilot was buried in the local cemetery. Now, what makes this story really special to me is that 1897, that's six years before the Wright brothers flew. And this was before there was anything man-made in the air. In fact, there had been balloons, but not free-flying balloons. During the war between the states, both sides would run up a balloon on a tether and have a guy up there with some binoculars, and they would try to spot troop movements. So balloons were nothing new, but the first powered airship or balloon flight took place in 1904, the same year as the Wright brothers flew, and it was the California era. So in 1897, there was nothing man-made in the air, and yet this story was covered in the newspapers in both Dallas and Fort Worth, and said a silver cigar-shaped object flying through the countryside struck a windmill at Aurora as it was settling towards Earth, apparently under having some sort of difficulty, exploded, and the pieces went everywhere. And it said the pilot, the Dallas Morning News, which is still in publication, said the pilot, enough of his remains were recovered to show that he was, quote, not an inhabitant of this world, end quote. Now, we'll save Aurora. There's a whole lot we can say about Aurora, but we'll save that for another night. But I simply want to add, for those of you who know about the Aurora story or have heard about it before, that the debunkers, they can't deny that this was covered in the newspaper at the time. They kind of gloss over the fact that it was not only in the Dallas Morning News, but also in the Fort Worth papers, and was also mentioned in some of the other local papers around here that I've dug into. But their main charge seems to be that, well, it was just a hoax story. The little town was having a hard time, and they were trying to build up some publicity and get people to come and move to the little town, which that always kind of strikes me as odd. Who would think that you say, hey, a spaceship crashed and a little spaceman was here? You know, what's that going to do to draw, maybe draw a crowd, but I don't think it's going to draw anybody to live there. But anyway, that's been the argument, that it was simply a hoax story planted in the newspapers to try to draw attention to the little town of Aurora. Well, that sounds reasonable enough, and I listened to that for a good number of years until I finally got hold of the entire front page of the Dallas Morning News for April the 19th, 1897. There are 16 stories on that front page. This is back at a time when there were no pictures in the newspaper and 8 columns, little bitty type. So you could get 16 stories on the front page plus 2 whole columns of little bitty copy-only ads, mostly for lawyers. And all 16 of the stories on this edition of the Dallas Morning News, every single one of them, that were coming from correspondents as far north as Oklahoma and as far south as Austin, Texas. Every single one of them was talking about the silver cigar-shaped object flying through the skies of North Texas. So even if you want to continue to argue that maybe it didn't crash in Aurora, there is no question that some type of object was flying in 1897 at a time 6 years before the Wright brothers ever flew. While I'm on the Wright brothers, let me point out a little something that you may or may not know about that. When the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, there were reporters from New York and Philadelphia and all of them up there. This was North Carolina, I believe. And they were all there. And they went back to the New York Times, all the news that fits, your newspaper of record, and they told them the Wright brothers have flown this airplane. The editors at the New York Times says, bourgeois, man was not meant to fly. If God had meant us to fly, he would have given us wings. And they refused to run the story. In fact, it was about a year after the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk that the New York Times finally got around to actually printing a story about their feat. And the only reason they did that was what I call magpie journalism. You know, one magpie, they'll all be sitting on the fence. You can even throw rocks at them, and they just sit there. But if you can get one of those magpies to fly off, then the whole flock takes off after them, and there they go. finally, after about a year, the Wright brothers were welcomed in France and invited to come over there and demonstrate their flying machine, which they did. And the European media just made hay out of it. They went wild. They printed big stories about, wow, man has finally developed heavier than air flight. And the European media was finally full of the development of the Wright brothers. And the good old New York Times finally followed suit about a year after their successful demonstration at Kitty Hawk. Now, why would I bother you with that little piece of historical minutia? Because, folks, just because it's not in the newspaper doesn't mean it's not happening, okay? Same thing with today with television. If just because you don't hear about it on television doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So we're going to be talking about all kinds of good stuff like that. And if you want to know more about Aurora, I'll be glad to take calls for that, as well as just about anything else. But it's funny how time flies when you're having fun. And time is a very funny thing. I'm sure that most of you who have looked into the UFO issue, you're well aware that one of the big issues involved in UFOs is missing time. The fella says, hey, I saw this UFO at 6 o'clock and I immediately went home, but when I got home it was 7 o'clock and I was only 10 minutes away from home. You know, I'm missing 50 minutes. Missing time. That's a big factor in the UFO genre and in the literature. What does all that mean? Well, what it means is that we're dealing with yet another dimension. When I was in school, we were taught there's only 3 dimensions. And then finally they got talking about time and they kind of added that as a 4th. And by now, the quantum physicists are saying, well, you know, it could be as many as 12 dimensions. And actually, I think there's probably many more than that, but we just hadn't got around to recognizing them yet or knowing that that's there. But time seems to be one of these dimensions. And so if that's the case, then time is relative. Have you ever noticed when you're having fun, time goes by real fast? Oh, Mom, I don't want to leave now. I'm having fun. But if you're not having a lot of fun, boy, this party's awful boring. Well, then time just drags. So I think that time is obviously relative to the perceiver and possibly even to its context within the dimensions. For example, I think we're all beginning to figure out that UFOs do not use ramjets, okay? They fly around on energy fields, in energy fields, and possibly flying along energy fields and energy lines, sometimes called ley lines, along the Earth. And I think that's then we can see a big clue when in the literature you always hear that when the UFO comes over, the car stops. And yet, how many of you have talked to a witness or heard somebody saw a UFO that said, well, then I put in the key and I turned the ignition on, I started the car again? No. It's when that energy field comes over, then it's not only negating gravity, it's negating time. And those pistons just lock and freeze, and their time basically stands still. And then when the energy field goes away, then you're back into normal time. The pistons go back to banging away. The car's running, and there you go. And it's kind of interesting because I actually got backhanded confirmation of this one night on a talk show when I was talking along these lines. And a fellow called in and says, well, I'm not so sure about that. Says, I drive a truck. And said, me and this other fellow, we saw this UFO. Says, but our trucks didn't stop running. And I said, well, sir, I said, chances are you have a diesel. He said, yep, I do. I said, well, there you go. I said, diesel engines run on compressed gas. but all the other cars run on an electrical system, and it's dependent on the spark plugs and the electricity. So when the energy field comes along, then it freezes up the electricity, everything stops flowing, and the car stops. But for the diesel engine, then that's not dependent on electricity. It's just running off of compressed gas. So it keeps going. Interesting, huh? Okay, well, we're coming up on the half hour. We're going to take a short break here in a few minutes. And let me catch my wind, more wind. Got to fill that bag up. And then we're going to come back, and hopefully we'll have some calls coming in. And the number again is 888-919-2355. And for all you good folks out there on the chat room, and I'm seeing some wild names up there. I'm seeing Aardvark and Uncle Ed and Mozilla One or something, and Jamie and Bump Mush. And man, listen, I'll tell you what, we got some good folks here tonight. So if you've got some questions, be sure to go ahead and type them in. And I've been assured that they have a procedure for getting these messages over this newfangled invention. So at this point, let's take about a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll take the calls when we come right back right after this. Howdy, we're back here on Epic Voyages, and got a great surprise for me anyway. We have already got a caller come in, and it's none other than our own Chase Klotsky. Chase, how are you this evening?
I'm great, Jim. How are you?
Well, if I was any better, I'd just be delirious.
That's awesome. Well, welcome to Inception Radio Network. This is the best place to be. But I have a question. It's actually a two-parter.
Okay, well, give me one at a time. My brain only functions, at a slow pace.
Okay, out of all your research and discovery, and you have a lot, your books cover a plethora of topics and theory and complicated situations. But out of all of them, Jim, was there one point when you had a document or a piece of evidence that you uncovered that really made you kind of sit back in your chair with that, oh my gosh, kind of wow? And what was that evidence or document? And I'll wait for the second part.
Okay. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
All right. I've covered Kennedy assassination, government cover-ups, UFOs, alien abductions, all of this weird stuff. But I want to tell you, one of the strangest incidents that I ever had happen to me was back when I was working the newspaper, and I began to investigate satanic cults. And I was making inquiries. I was starting to do some checking around. I was checking with my police sources. And I think the reason, as I recall, was this was back in the 70s. And I think the reason for this sudden interest was that the cattle mutilations. And and they were claiming that it was the result of a satanic cult or whatever, which I eventually decided is not the case. And I think you know that as well. But I did start digging into satanic cults, and next thing I know, I was getting these odd phone calls, and people would hang up, and then one day I showed up at work, and there was a little doll of me with pins sticking in it, and I accused my fellow newsmen of pulling this gag on me, but nobody ever confessed. And, after a while, after 6 months, a year, you'd think somebody would finally say, yeah, okay, I did that. But nobody ever said that. And I don't know, it was pretty strange. It was like, I think there are some warped individuals out there somewhere.
Absolutely. The second part of my question, which is a totally different question, but it comes off the same preference, which is, out of all your research and discovery, what do you most hope is not true, and what do you most hope is true out of all you've uncovered?
Oh, man, you're really asking some hard questions here. Well, not hard questions, but
Oh my gosh. In Nashville, I stood in line for 3 days and couldn't get near you. All your fans were surrounding you. It's like, this was my first chance. I was so happy. I've called like 3 times.
well, and these are great questions, okay? I'll tell you the thing that I hope is not true, but I know it is that our votes do not count anymore, thanks to computer voter fraud. I've studied that, looked at that enough. I can still recall that back in, I think, 2000, even before we had the great crisis over hanging Chad.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I think it was ABC that gave a housewife $12 worth of software, and she was able to hack into a voting machine. Okay? It's that simple. And of course, they have people who can sit back and hack and go in and change up the basic codes. And we haven't got time to go through the list of states that have had voting fraud problems. And I know California and several other states have decertified certain of these machines, and yet they just keep going out, buying more and more and more. And I'm out here in rural Texas, and just up until the last election, we were still using paper ballots, and all of a sudden now we've got the touchstone computer thing. And of course, I talked to the election judge down there, good old boy, and I said, "If you think these things could be hacked?" "Oh, no, they tell us that these things can't be hacked. They're just fine." Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. I sure appreciate that. And I think that's the thing that scares me worst, is that when we don't have a vote, we don't have a democracy. I hope that's not true. But I'm afraid it is.
And what do you most hope out of your research is absolutely true? I asked this question to Nick Redfern, and he said the aliens that look like Angelina Jolie.
Well, I suppose I could handle that. But no, actually, I was thinking along similar lines. I think there is a huge universe out there, and it's an energetic universe. We're all beings of energy, but we don't know that because we're just trapped in these meat sacks, right? And then dragging around. And of course, the people who would like to control this world, they're hard at work trying to make us overweight and undernourished, and putting GMOs in our food, spraying chemicals in the air. They're doing everything they can to physically debilitate us. And yet, if we ever understood that the physical body is not really it's our energy. And the correlation that I point out is, Chase, it's like your computer, okay? Your computer's just plastic and cardboard and a little bit of solder, a few wires. So physically, it's not much. But your computer can add, subtract, can actually come up with artificial intelligence, can actually do a lot of neat things. And it's because of the